It's an important next step for the full and successful implementation of the Act.
Tonight, the federal government announces over $500 million for Bill C-92.
Anyways, the deadly, I'm all deadly is basically what you gotta know.
And we meet the creators of The Feather, a satirical news show out of Saskatchewan. Good evening, I'm Brittany Hobson. It's been almost a year since Bill C-92 came into effect. This morning, the Prime Minister announced $500 million for its implementation. The bill addresses the underfunding for Indigenous children in the child welfare system and allows home communities to exercise jurisdiction over their well-being. Jamie Pashagumskum has more.
Justin Trudeau made the announcement for Rideau Cottage Friday, saying the initiative will result in fewer kids in care and will reunite Indigenous families.
Our government is investing $542 million to Indigenous communities to exercise full jurisdiction over child and family services. This is vital to moving forward on our promise to address the unacceptable injustices that too many kids and families have faced in the care system.
Indigenous Services Minister Mark Miller called the current system a humanitarian crisis. He says the reforms to the system were co-developed with Indigenous partners.
It's an important next step for the full and successful implementation of the Act. It will ensure that it is funding First Nations, Inuit, and Métis groups to work within and across their communities to build strong foundations and support them in engaging communities and hiring experts to develop models and legislations.
Miller also announced COVID supports for teens aging out of care.
To make sure that they get the support they need, we will continue to cover eligible costs for First Nations, child and family service agencies providing services to youth who would normally be aging out of care during this time, and do so as long as the pandemic lasts.
Miller promised to continue to engage with partners to identify needs for their jurisdiction over child and family services. Jamie Pashagumskum, APTN National News, Ottawa.
First Nations in Quebec were dealt a heavy blow this week. Government officials rejected Joyce's principle, named for Joyce Echaquan, over use of the term systemic racism. In response, opposition parties say the province needs to snap out of it. Lindsay Richardson explains.
Joyce, c'est notre George Floyd.
Joyce Echaquan is our George Floyd. Greg Kelly, Liberal Party critic for Indigenous Affairs in Quebec, said on Friday morning, like Floyd, Echaquan's last moments were captured on video. She died at Joliet Hospital in late September while caregivers made racist remarks.
Justice for Joyce! Justice for Joyce! Justice for Joyce!
It mobilized support. The Atikamekw Nation quickly drafted Joyce's principle, one requiring Quebec recognize the systemic racism Indigenous peoples are faced with. This week, Kelly stood up in the National Assembly urging Quebec to adopt it officially.
And it was rejected, mostly because of two words, systemic racism.
Kelly's motion, asserting First Nations' fundamental right to health care, drew this response.
Y a-t-il consentement pour débattre de cette motion?
Pas de consentement, Monsieur le Président.
Pas de consentement.
By comparison, just minutes earlier, a motion asserting the need to protect the French language received a standing ovation and zero objections. For opposition leaders, the evidence is on the table.
After the Commission Vane report, after the Principe de Joyce document, it is clearly documented in Quebec that systemic racism exists in our institutions.
Lorsqu'on parle de racisme systémique, on n'a pas la même vision.
After the hearing, Indigenous Affairs Minister Yann Lafrenière said Quebec and First Nations don't have the same vision of the issue.
Cependant, je veux vous rassurer, ça ne nous empêche pas de travailler ensemble.
AFNQL Regional Chief Ghislain Picard says it will. Quote, what is at stake here on a human, social, and political level must leave no room for partisan pettiness. The AFNQL will not accept it. The Atikamekw Nation says they're shaken up. Grand Chief Constant Awashish asks, don't we all want to create decolonized institutions for our children? For Manawan Chief Paul-Émile Ottawa, the government's response reminds us the political will is not there. Kelly calls directly on Lafrenière to push the government for an acknowledgement, but Lafrenière didn't budge Friday afternoon.
This is a wonderful program. We believe in that. you do understand that we don't have the same definition of the systemic racism. That's the reason why that's the only part of it that we put aside.
He says he's committed to making gradual changes in this area. However,
but we agree to disagree on the systemic approach.
Lindsay Richardson, APTN National News, Montreal.
Time now for our first break. Coming up, a trip to a Vancouver bank ends in handcuffs and a human rights complaint.
If you're going to be detained, you shouldn't be put in handcuffs. And it just wasn't right.
It was supposed to be a simple trip to the bank, but it ended up with a grandfather and granddaughter getting handcuffed. Now the 911 transcript from that incident in downtown Vancouver has been released. Tina House has more.
On December the 20th, 2019, Maxwell Johnson and his granddaughter came here to this Bank of Montreal in downtown Vancouver to open a joint bank account. Upon giving the teller their status cards, the teller told them she had to verify their IDs. A half hour later, 2 Vancouver police officers arrived, took the pair outside, and handcuffed both Maxwell and his 12-year-old granddaughter. They were let go a short time later, but the experience still haunts Maxwell.
It was the police officers, their discretion on whether or not to handcuff us or not. Like just been taken out of the bank and put in handcuffs and then told we're not being under arrest, we are being detained. I don't understand that. If you're going to be detained, you shouldn't be put in handcuffs. And it just wasn't right.
The 911 transcripts have now been released, and here is a highlight of what was said. It's the Bank of Montreal on the corner of Dunsmuir and Burrard. We have customers here that have presented a fake ID. That we have confirmed. We were on hold for about 10 minutes with a non-emergency line, but we were told by the Indian, the government, to contact the police because the IDs that they have are fake and they're trying to open accounts as well as trying to be part of another customer's account, which I cannot confirm if this is him or not. Maxwell, who suffers from anxiety and a panic disorder, says it should have been dealt with better.
Like if they had questions about Tories, they could have asked me, or we could have phoned the membership office here and they could have dealt with it there.
A human rights complaint against Vancouver police as well as the Bank of Montreal has been filed. Part of that statement read, "Seeing his granddaughter in handcuffs caused Maxwell to think about the history of residential school and the people in his community being put in handcuffs and taken away from their families in boats." During the interaction with the VPD, Torianne was very upset and worried about her grandfather.
I find it to be very courageous for Max and Torianne to stand up and, to stand up in the face of, what happened to them. So for other people that, are learning about what happened, to know that, they have the strength within them as well to stand up and to be treated this way is not okay. Sensitivity training should be mandatory for every staff member that works within, the BMO. Not, and like I said, not just, limiting to this one branch, but nationally.
The human rights complaints have been filed provincially and federally. Tina House, APTN National News, Vancouver.
The government of the Northwest Territories is considering changes to strict COVID-19 isolation measures. For the entirety of the pandemic, anyone coming into the territory must isolate for 2 weeks in either Yellowknife, Hay River, Fort Smith, or Inuvik. But some communities want residents to be able to isolate in their homes. Joining us now is Yellowknife reporter Charlotte Mort-Jacobs to explain where the government is at, the cost of the isolation, and the next steps. Thanks for joining us today, Charlotte. What are the current health measures in place, and how do the isolation centres operate?
Hi, Brittany. So since March 18th, the government of the Northwest Territories has made 14-day isolation mandatory for anyone entering the territory who's a non-essential person. And we have 4 isolation hubs in the NWT: Yellowknife, Fort Smith, Hay River, and Inuvik. So anyone coming in needs to isolate there. So that's been ongoing since the entirety of the pandemic, really. And the COVID Secretariat, which is a new department created in pandemic response by the GNWT, they've created a feedback report on how they think they're doing, getting feedback from Indigenous governments, communities, stakeholders, businesses, and that's really what's moving us forward to understand how people are feeling about this self-isolation.
Now, what highlights did you see from this feedback report published?
Yes, so much of the feedback was centered around the cost of isolation if you cannot self-isolate if you're at one of the isolation hubs. And communities and Indigenous governments are really concerned about the cost it's costing taxpayers. Currently, it's about $4,000 per person for 2 weeks to stay at one of the isolation hubs. And the GNWT has spent more than half of their budget that was budgeted for health measures for the pandemic response. So a lot of Indigenous governments and communities are really urging the government to explore the option of allowing community members to be able to self-isolate in their own community. Now, how that would play out is still uncertain, and the report really was divided on what measures should be taken to ensure that there's equitable access to self-isolation. If communities are unable to physically distance, would they be on the hook then to stay at one of the isolation hubs? Reducing taxpayer dollars that are going towards the isolation hubs has raised the question of whether or not we should be paying for individuals who go down south for, say, vacation or non-essential travel. So Indigenous governments and communities are still on the fence on what the government should be doing to reduce costs and how that would roll out, but there certainly is a push for community members to be able to go back home and not have to isolate in one of the hubs.
We just have a bit of time left, so just to end off here, what will the government do with this feedback?
So this was really one of the first reports of its kind since the creation of the COVID Secretariat Department. Now, the Premier and our Chief Medical Health Officer, Dr. Cami Candola, have both been very adamant that they are against travel over the holiday season. They're really urging, community members not to be going down south. And they also have been saying that they're in conversation with the federal government on vaccination rollout because the NWT has a high Indigenous population. We are a priority for vaccination. Whether or not we'll get that in the spring is another question. So right now it's kind of at a standstill on how the government will respond now that they have this feedback.
Okay, thanks for that, Charlotte. That's all the time that we have today.
Thank you.
Coming up next, a satirical newscast out of Saskatchewan pushes the envelope when it comes to Indigenous humor.
18, and hopefully, I hope elders are laughing at our videos when they see them.
Welcome back. It's time now for our photo of the day. Our viewer Anne Abraham sent us this late night firewood run. She is just north of the Takla Nation, located in the heart of British Columbia. Keep those photos coming by sending them to share@aptn.ca. We want to see you, your land, and the things you love, and maybe your picture will be our next photo of the day. Now let's take a look at tomorrow's weather forecast. Here is tomorrow's weather forecast beginning on the East Coast. 9 above and cloudy in Halifax, 3 degrees in Charlottetown, -3 in Happy Valley, Goose Bay, some sun and -4 in Nain, 2 degrees in Quebec City, 5 above in Montreal, 6 and sunny with a mix of sun and cloud in Sarnia and Windsor, 1 above in Sudbury, Timmins, and Wawa. In northern Manitoba, -8 in snow in Puckatawagan, -5 in God's Lake. Sunny skies and 5 above in Winnipeg, 6 degrees in Brandon. In Saskatchewan, 2 above in Swift Current, 1 in snow in Yorkton, -6 in La Ronge, and -12 in Stony Rapids. Heading to northern Alberta, it's -14 and some sun in High Level, -1 in Grand Prairie. 9 above with some sun in Calgary, 3 degrees in Medicine Hat. In the west coast, 9 above in Victoria and Vancouver. -1 with a mix of sun and cloud in Prince George, 0 in Smithers. In the Yukon, -18 in Beaver Creek, -11 in Mayo. Over to the NWT, some sunny skies and -11 in Fort Liard and Trout Lake. -17 in Colville Lake, 16 below in Fort McPherson. In Nunavut, -20 in snow in Chesterfield, 12 below in Arviat. -25 with some sun in Igloolik, and -22 in Clyde River. Laughter is good for the soul, and a group of Indigenous comedians in Saskatoon are doing just that. They've taken to social media to report their own version of the news. Priscilla Wolf has the story.
Hi, I'm Danny Knight, and welcome to The Feather, where it's civilized in the front, but savage in the back.
Well, I'm half Korean, half Mohawk. I come from Little Pine Reserve, but lived in Saskatoon all my life. And also my mom's from Akwesasne Mohawk Nation.
Yeah, I'm Cree, just little old Nahiao, but I'm from Muscatine First Nation, and my mom's from God's Lake Narrows and Manitoba, so I'm half Plains Cree and a little bit of is it Swampy Cree or something like Tree Cree, Northern Cree. Anyways, I'm all deadly is basically. Basically what you got to know.
Ryan Moccasin came up with the idea with some funding from the Sask Arts Board and help from Paved Arts in Saskatoon. The Feather took to the air, and they are now on season 2.
It was like they were just webisodes. Like we would just do a news monologue, and then we had this interview show. But for season 2 of The Feather, it's like we wanted to do it like a full episode.
Now we go to Sean Loosemoose interviewing Saskatchewan's first Indigenous police chief.
So we're very excited to have you with us here today.
The Feather can be found on Facebook and YouTube.
We have a YouTube is The Feather. That one's a little hard to find. So if you're looking at us on YouTube, type in The Feather and then type in 60 scoops of WTF, and you'll find us for sure. Yeah, and then we're also on Twitter at The Feather News.
The guys say they have a lot of fun doing the live online show, and that they have one coming up very soon.
And then we're doing our next live stream on December 3rd, and that's so we can interact with our audience at the same time. It's really fun, actually.
They perform for an adult audience, and they hope that elders and non-Indigenous people tune in.
Treaty 6 The Gathering. Now is your chance to colonize an entire culture. That's right. Land so nice, you have to steal it twice.
18, and hopefully, I hope elders are laughing at our videos when they see them. You know what I mean? Like,
and some of them may even be a little bit educational.
Yes, it's good. Yeah, good for your Moonyow friends to watch.
Priscilla Wolf, APTN National News, Saskatoon.
In part 2 of A Life Sentence, APTN Investigates digs into the case of 2 sisters who say they were wrongfully convicted of second-degree murder and found 3 other white men were killed in a 2-year period before the trial. leading to suspicions of devil worshipping. Producer Holly Moore is here to talk about that. Thanks for joining us today, Holly. We'll get right into it. How does devil worshipping fit into this case?
Well, hi, Brittany. It's, it was a very strange aspect to this case that came out in our research. So if you remember back in the mid-90s, there was a satanic panic that swept across Canada and the globe. And it actually was centered in Martensville, Saskatchewan, where a daycare had been accused of mass child abuse of the children in their care. So law enforcement were really, really thinking about satanic worship. They were, suspicious that people were being motivated by satanic cults. So in the doc, what we found was in the court documents, the police actually asked Odelia, "Are you a devil worshiper?" And she says, "No, I'm not even going to answer that question." Her sister was also accused of being a devil worshiper. She tells a story of, her daughter saying that the girls had run across, meaning across a field. And she said that the officer perked right up and said, "What cross? What cross?" So it was a very strange aspect in what was otherwise a very brutal and horrifying crime that really shook this community.
Very strange and interesting elements indeed. What else did you find out?
Well, around the same time, there were 3 murders of non-Indigenous men by groups of Indigenous people. So again, a strange coincidence, a strange context. There were 3 murders that all happened within 24 months of Joe Dolph's murder. And so the community was really shaken by this. There was a lot of public outcry. There was a lot of racial tension that was simmering over. The final murder happened just basically about 23 miles away from Joe Dolph's house. A man was helping a group of people who had claimed to have car trouble, John Sorgensen, and that just shook the community, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous. So some of the people that are helping Odelia and Narissa say that, the context is really important. This is where the jury was pulled from. So we can't ignore that context.
And lastly, who was signed on to help?
Well, there's some very high-profile people helping right now. David Milgaard, of course, is Canada's best-known wrongfully convicted survivor. We have James Lockyer, who is the criminal lawyer and the founder of Innocence Canada. He's a really well-known lawyer in wrongful conviction circles. We also have Jolene Johnson, who's a private investigator who was recruited essentially by David Milgaard to help dig up evidence. She got the transcript that showed, that Odelia never confessed to the crime, that the statements were taken and not recorded. So, there's quite a few people really trying to get these convictions looked at, number one, and secondly, either overturned or downgraded to manslaughter charges. So Odelia has been in jail for more than 25 years, for a second-degree murder that she says she didn't commit.
Okay, well, thank you for that update, Holly, and thanks for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Brittany.
You can watch part 2 of A Life Sentence in just a few minutes on APTN Investigates. And that's all your APTN National News for this Friday, November 27th. You can find more Indigenous news at aptnnews.ca or at APTN News on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. We're also on TikTok, so give us a follow there. Stick around, APTN Investigates is up next. I'm Brittany Hobson. Have a great night.